Because the internet is absolutely obsessed with EV towing, and of course Rivian says the R1S can tow over 7,000 pounds, it's time to put that to the test. We're going to go ahead and attach a flatbed trailer, put some weight on it, and then talk about how the R1S drives.
Hey guys, down here in the corner just for a moment. If you haven't already watched part 1 of this video, there's going to be a link at the end, so be sure and check that out. We decided to split this into 2 different videos because together it would have been nearly an hour, and I thought that was really quite long for just a single video. The other thing that you should know before we roll through the towing section is that Rivian is prepping a new software update for the R1T and R1S that's going to address a lot of various towing functions. Also, there have been some suspension tweaks over time as well. So be sure and stay tuned for an updated video just as soon as they roll that software update out, and then we have the ability to test it. I haven't been told exactly what is in that update as of the filming of this video, but I really hope it addresses some of the autonomous driving safety systems that get disabled when a trailer is connected. It may also have something to do with some of the trailer stability and trailer profile and trailer behavior concerns that some folks have raised with the R1T and R1S. So with that in mind, let's just roll through the rest of the video and then stay tuned because we are going to have updated coverage of the software updates that Rivian has been promising.
With the hitch cover off, we find a 2-inch receiver right here. It is located kind of far back under there, something I noticed in the R1T as well, but I think it's a lot less of a problem in the R1S because it's more normative for SUVs to have a hitch receiver tucked up a little bit further under there. Otherwise, you have a cover with kind of a weird bulge on the back. This also helps improve departure angles because for those that aren't towing and want to off-road, it's going to give you more clearance. Now, it's not really a clearance problem for some hitches, except some of the shorter ones, those might be really close to the bumper. This one, not too much of a problem, but also those safety chain locations, they're pretty far in there. The backup camera location appears to be pretty decent, and then of course we get the air suspension, which you can use to lower the vehicle, and then position right over the ball. Oh, not quite low enough. Let's see if we can actually go a little bit lower here. Let's go ahead and put it in conserve. Select the lowest ride height. See if that gets us where we need to go. Nope. Oh, we did it. And then we just raise the ride height back to high, and then let's go ahead and see if that works. Why, look at that. We are now connected to the trailer. Easy peasy, thank you, air suspension. Absolutely no problem with these larger tow hooks. That's not too big of a problem. The emergency brake connection for this trailer, that is a little bit different. Goes on right like that though. Integrated trailer brake controller, so we can just plug right in. Now let's get some weight. Now this situation might sound contrived, but I actually ended up buying this trailer so I could take this baby excavator in for service. So, you know, this is something I actually do with my own SUV now and then, in addition to collecting water tanks and doing all sorts of other things that you might end up needing to do out here in the woods, out in the country, wherever it is you might live. And that is why I absolutely love tilt bed trailers like this, because you can just drive right on up. Of course, you can adjust the weight on the trailer depending on exactly where you want the weight to be centered. Let's get it right, about right, and then we could go ahead and measure the actual hitch weight, tongue weight, which I recommend doing every time. Good to go. Now let's talk about what's on the back. This is a combination of about 7,600 pounds of trailer weight. The trailer weighs just over 3,500 pounds in its own right, the excavator just over 4,000 pounds. So that gives us to around that 7,600 pound mark. Obviously we have the vehicle in towing mode, we have it connected to the back, we have the weight distribution hitch installed, etc. Everything is set up as it should be. Let's get the R1S out on the road. The first thing you'll notice when you connect a trailer is that some of the systems on the vehicle turn off. Rather unfortunately, that includes blind spot monitoring. Something I noted in the R1T happens in the R1S as well. I think that's a bit of a bummer because active safety systems in other vehicles stay on when a trailer is connected. Specifically, a decent number of vehicles maintain not only blind spot monitoring, but they expand that blind spot monitoring to the trailer's blind spot when a trailer is connected. Also, it does appear that the emergency autonomous braking system also disables itself when a trailer's connected. The next thing you'll notice is that in towing mode, it defaults the ride quality to stiff. That makes sense because it needs to make sure and limit that suspension travel since we have a lot of weight back there. And it gives you the choice of just standard or low for the ride height. But again, the suspension is pretty high off the road because this is 11 inches of ground clearance even in the standard mode. The next thing you should know is that adjusting the trailer brake is done on the screen, and then if you want to activate the trailer brake manually, say you're having a trailer sway issue, you press and hold the right side button on the steering wheel in order to do that. So the left side one is still going to be the volume roller knob. On the right side, this is now going to be trailer braking. And last but not least, we get an adjusted range display on the instrument cluster. The range has gone down by a little bit less than half now that the trailer's been attached to it. This does not appear to be any sort of adaptive or predictive measure for towing. It just seems to be a slice right off the top. And that's because the Rivian does not ask you about trailer profiles or trailer dimensions like we do find in the Ford F-150 Lightning. In that vehicle, you attach trailer, it asks you how heavy is the trailer, how big is the trailer, how wide is the trailer, etc. And then it's going to try and use a database of calculations to adjust a theoretically more rational, more realistic estimate of your trailer range. And then, of course, we get the regenerative braking on the vehicle, which again is not blended braking, it's just throttle liftoff regen. Now, I do have the regen set to high, and it does a pretty good job keeping the trailer under control, but when you put your foot on the brake pedal, it's not going to give you extra regen. Just things to keep in mind. Getting this combination out on the road is honestly a piece of cake. In fact, you have to be a little bit careful sometimes with the Rivian because there is so much power. This went 0 to 60 in 2.9 seconds every time. Even when the battery state of charge was around 25%, this is still wicked fast. This is one of the faster EVs you can get in the US, and it has that towing capacity in the back. Speaking of that, even when 7,600 pounds is on the back, we recorded 7.2 seconds 0 to 60. So getting onto the freeway with a heavy trailer, absolutely not a problem. Getting a little carried away with your right foot when a trailer connected to the back, that logically could be a bit of a problem. Stopping distances, as long as we're not talking about with a trailer on the rear, that came in at 125 feet, which is pretty acceptable. Keep in mind that the curb weight of this is over 7,000 pounds. 7,069 pounds, apparently, to be exact, for this model. When we eventually get the Max Pack available in the Rivian lineup, expect those curb weights to tick upwards, but it's not going to be a doubling of the pack size we find on this vehicle. It's going to go from 135 kilowatt hours to about 180, so you should expect an approximate percentage increase right along those lines as far as the pack weight. Curb weight, my expectation to be maybe about 500 pounds or so. It's probably not going to be a huge deal. Any way you slice it, this is notably lighter than a Hummer EV, and you are certainly going to feel it out on the road. This is going to stop shorter, it's going to handle better, it's going to feel more like a regular SUV, I guess you'd say, out on the road. In my handling tests, this does excellent as far as its grip level. However, feel is definitely a different matter. We have a lot of ground clearance. We have the adaptive air suspension system, etc. So it's going to feel a little bit more vague, a little bit more ponderous out on the road. It's going to feel like it has a bit more lean. In reality, the center of gravity is very low for a vehicle that has nearly a foot of ground clearance, but you're still going to feel it. It's still going to feel like a tall Range Rover, like a tall Jeep Grand Cherokee L, something along those lines. But again, it does well when you start pushing it harder. Theoretically, with this quad motor setup, you have the advantage of torque vectoring on the rear and torque vectoring on the front, but you're never really going to notice pulling you aggressively around the corners. It's not going to feel like Acura Super Handling all-wheel drive or a BMW performance torque vectoring system in some of their M models. It does a good job, but it's pretty subtle. Just hangs out in the background, not really calling attention to itself, I guess you could say. Ride quality is something that a lot of folks had complained about when they first drove the R1S, and it's something that I had noted in the R1T, but it's something that Rivian has definitely addressed. Right now, we're in the firmest suspension mode, we're in the stiff mode, and you will definitely notice that this feels stiff. And because this has such a rigid body, it kind of feels like a board clattering across pavement at times. If you're in the sportiest drive mode at a relatively low suspension height, and you're in the stiffest suspension mode, it definitely will still have that feel. However, in all-purpose, and especially in conserve mode, the ride quality is going to be considerably better than it was before. And that's certainly something that I noticed driving this compared with the R1T. Now, R1T to R1S, there are going to be a few intrinsic differences because this is a little bit more than a foot shorter, so the curb weight is going to be a little bit different, the weight is arranged differently in the vehicle, and of course we don't have that pickup truck bed in the back. But despite the lack of the bed and that big cargo area in the rear, cabin noise is pretty quiet, 69.5 decibels. I will say though that you do hear a little bit more electric motor whine in this cabin than you do in some competitive EVs. So you'll definitely hear the electric motors a little bit more than in the Model X or the EQS, probably than the EV9, although I haven't driven it. I have heard that that model is very quiet, so stay tuned and wait for that video to come out soon. But in regular highway driving, mountain driving, rough road driving, etc., this has a really quiet and isolated ride quality to it. And they have finally adapted the air suspension, I think, to give this a more appropriate luxury car ride, as long as you don't have a trailer on the back. Let's talk about what I would describe as the towing nature of the R1T and the R1S. In case you're wondering, this is not technically a unibody SUV. This is actually a body-on-frame, I guess you could say body-on-battery EV, like the R1T. We have a frame below where the battery is integrated, the electric drive motors are integrated, etc. But what makes this different than something like a Lightning or a Tahoe, etc., is that the body is not completely isolated from the frame. The frame is bolted onto the body, but theoretically you could unbolt the body, and that's kind of Rivian's thing. Skateboard platform that can be utilized in a wide variety of different vehicles, and then a different box on top. Truck-based box for the R1T, SUV body for the R1S. It's a very logical arrangement. And it does yield seemingly a little bit more isolation when towing a trailer like this than an actual unibody SUV, say like a Dodge Durango. I tow with the Dodge Durango on a regular basis because it's one of the only SUVs that is a mid-size SUV that can tow over 7,000 pounds. It's actually rated to tow over 8,000 pounds. So this trailer combo, absolutely not a problem. But the feel of this trailer on the back of this vehicle, definitely different than the Durango. This feels like it's being pushed around a little bit more than the Durango, but I don't think that's actually the case. I think it's just the way the regenerative braking, etc., is done in this vehicle and the adaptive air suspension, which allows perhaps a little bit more suspension movement as the trailer is pushing the vehicle around. It is something you will get used to, but it is something you will need to get used to because it's going to feel different than something you might be familiar with already. You will notice that perhaps a bit more in the R1T, I would say, because it feels so differently than every other truck that it's competing with, the gasoline trucks. This, it may not be that much different. It certainly is a little bit closer, I would say, to a Grand Cherokee L with the adaptive air suspension than a regular steel spring setup vehicle out there than a pickup truck, but it's still going to feel a little bit different. The other thing you're likely to notice is the amount of regen braking you get or don't get with this vehicle. And I say don't get because regen braking is pretty darn aggressive. This has one pedal driving just like you'd expect in a modern EV. You can lower that down to a still pretty aggressive one pedal drive mode. But if the battery has over 50% state of charge or so, it actually is quite high, it really limits the regenerative potential going downhill. You'll get full regen for a while, and then as you start going down the hill, it will start really dropping that amount of regen down. So you're not going to get that one pedal feel going downhill if the battery is anywhere over about 50-60% state of charge, especially on longer downhill runs. I don't quite understand why that is because no other EV manufacturer takes quite that course of action. We'll have to see exactly if Rivian can give us an answer as to why that is. I'll go ahead and post on the screen or post a follow-up video about that. But once the battery is a little bit lower in state of charge, something I noticed with this trailer, it has no problem keeping up the regen going all the way back downhill. Turns out I may have spoken too soon on the limit for regen braking. I just got a little notice here on the instrument cluster, and my regen braking potential has been cut approximately in half. It actually is shrinking as we're going down this hill, so certainly something still to keep in mind. Personally, I would prefer if we had paddles on the back of the steering wheel to adjust the throttle lift-off regen, and I would love it if this had a blended braking system where you could have a mode where there was no throttle lift-off regen, so if you're really trying to hypermile, that would be the most advantageous mode to be in. Still, as it is, I think that Rivian has done an excellent job, and you will certainly notice this has a lot of power going uphill with the trailer connected or not. It also has a really great feel out on rougher road surfaces or gravel road surfaces where a regular pickup truck or a body-on-frame vehicle with a part-time four-wheel drive system would be scrabbling for traction. This, with the 4 electric motors, it's decent at sending power around exactly where it needs to. Now it's time to talk about fuel economy and range. Over a week of mixed driving, I've been getting about 2.35 miles per kilowatt hour. For this vehicle, that actually puts it above the EPA range estimate, so 303 miles for this model. In my daily driving, including highway, city driving, mountain climbing, etc., I should be getting about 316 miles of range if I wanted to completely deplete the battery. And that's the reason that I don't really want to talk about range in gross numbers like that. I would rather talk about it in terms of efficiency, because you decide what your comfort level is as far as depleting your battery. Maybe you only want to run it down to 10%, something like that. Maybe you only want to charge to 90% for improved battery life. You need to factor that in to your range calculations. Now, one thing that a lot of folks get wrong is that EVs automatically drastically cut your range in half. I've said it before and I'll say it again. A, that's not true, and B, when you hear people talking about it in those terms, they're looking at the wrong number. So say Ford F-150 Lightning, they say, well, you know, it only did 200 something miles, and that's a huge reduction in range versus 320. Well, no F-150 Lightning is rated to do 320 miles at 70 miles an hour out on the highway, even without a trailer connected to it. The EPA rating for highway driving is just about 280 miles for that vehicle. So when you're taking a look at those kinds of range reductions, take a look at their actual highway range ability, then reduce when you have a trailer connected. This got 1.25 miles per kilowatt hour with the trailer connected. So A, yes, that is a pretty healthy reduction. And for this particular vehicle, that is a reduction of about 50%. But we did not notice that same reduction in the R1T and in the Lightning, perhaps because they aren't quite as efficient. Or they're just a little bit more aerodynamic with the trailer connected. Any way you slice it, you should expect a solid range reduction when a trailer's connected. I'm just going to go ahead and pause on this private road because I can and whip out my calculator and say that should give this vehicle about a realistic range with the trailer connected of about 168 miles if you were to go from completely full to completely empty. In a rational world, you would probably want to DC charge this about every 100 miles or so. You have to decide whether that's something you can live with or not. Not everybody is going to be in a situation where that will work for them, but for a lot of folks, it could be just fine. If that, however, applies to you, you might really want to wait for the max pack. Now it's time to tackle a relatively minor trail, but this trail is a little narrow here and there because we have recently trimmed and not everything has been fed into the chipper. So there are some things here and there's some areas we can't go in this R1S, mainly because A, it doesn't have all-terrain tires, and B, Rivian would probably like it to come back without any paint damage or pinstriping, so that's going to limit the kinds of things we do. But let's still talk about what we can. So on these downhill runs, I think that Rivian has done a really good job with the regenerative brake tuning, and that definitely makes off-road trails like this feel very easy to deal with. Instead of needing hill descent control, it just has regenerative braking control on all four motors. So that's a really great touch. You don't have to engage it separately. You just choose the kind of terrain you're on, whether you want soft sand, rock crawl, rally, drift, or the all-terrain mode, which is what we're in now. And then we have those three different ride heights to choose from, basically 11 inches, 13 inches, and 15 inches. Right now I'm in the 15-inch ride height mode because that's going to give us a decent amount of ground clearance, more than a foot, but it's also going to give us the most suspension travel in either direction versus the highest height mode. As we see in other vehicles with independent suspensions, if I put this in the highest height mode at 15 inches of ground clearance, it's basically pushing the tires all the way down to the ground. And that means that there's going to be a lot less suspension motion available in one direction. You're going to have tons in the upward direction, not a lot in the downward direction. Now, even in this highest height mode, it does not feel like a first generation Grand Cherokee air suspension, where it really was at the bottom of its suspension travel, and it then felt like you had just bolted the tires onto the car. It felt like there was not a lot of suspension going on at all. This does not feel like that. However, there is a 20-mile-an-hour speed limit because of how far this has now pushed everything down there. But if you're on a trail like this, where there are going to be some things that we have deep ruts, we have sticks and branches and tree limbs, etc., that have come down in the winter, it is going to be handy for these kinds of situations. There's a pretty deep rut here. This has absolutely no problem going over it. The size and the width of the Rivian is a bit more of an issue on some of these trails. And again, the all-season tires. These sticks right here, absolutely no problem at all. You can hear one hit the underbelly of the vehicle, but it has a completely armored underbelly. They didn't scrape along, however, and I know that those branches are about 10 inches tall because I recently had another vehicle out here with about 10 inches of clearance, and they were still touching the underside. They were definitely rattling around underneath Jeep Compass that we had here as well with about 8 inches of clearance. So clearance is definitely a big asset. The quad motor setup in the Rivian is a little bit controversial. No Rivian has a locking differential. In fact, this Rivian has no differential at all, just has 4 electric motors. If you get the dual electric motor Rivian, then you do get open differentials front and rear. No limited slip, no lockers there. If you're in the dual motor Rivian and it wants to send power across the axle, it has to use the brakes in order to slow down the spinning wheel, send power across. There are pros and cons to that. You can use it in a wider variety of situations than you would be able to use a locker. On the other hand, it's not going to be quite as effective as an actual mechanical locker. The other thing you should know is that you can never send all 800 horsepower to a single wheel, like theoretically I guess you could in a supercharged pickup truck or something like that, because each wheel only has one motor attached to it. And in this vehicle, 800 and some odd horsepower is split between 4 wheels, 900 pound-feet of torque split between 4 wheels. So each one's going to get just over 200 ponies. That's a reasonable amount of power on a single wheel, but it's not 600 horsepower, it's not 700 horsepower, and it's certainly not 800 horsepower. Should you be in the unfortunate position, sorry, I'm looking at a tree over there that I'm just barely missing. Should you be in the unfortunate situation where you need to direct more power to a single wheel, here you just have to hope that the massive amounts of low-end torque, basically torque at 0 RPM that we get out of an electric motor, is going to be enough. Now, in these 3-point turn situations, I can't continue because there's a tree down over there. These 3-point turn situations, you'll definitely notice that this is more nimble than the R1T because it's about 16 inches or so shorter. So reasonable amount shorter than that truck version, and that does make it easier to place out on trails like this. It's a little bit hard to tell at the moment, but right now we're in an off-camber situation where I actually have 2 wheels up in the air. The left front one is up in the air and the right rear is up in the air, and that's because I kind of need to go around this pretty angled hillside here. We'll see how this performs. One thing I noticed in the R1T is that because we don't have a locker, you are going to get wheel slip before the system starts sending traction around, and that's just the way motors like this have to work. So in some situations, you'll notice definitely wheel slip, wheel slip. It's doing it though. But it's slipping a lot. There we go. Totally fine. But it feels a bit more like a luxury SUV without lockers at all. So something along the lines of, a Volvo XC90, BMW X5, Mercedes-Benz GLE, etc. They're going to feel kind of like that in similar situations. This has much better software as far as directing the power around, and it feels more confident. But the amount of wheel slip you get with a quad motor setup like this is definitely going to be similar, and that's something that I noticed in the Hummer as well. I am not the biggest fan of tearing up trails because A, it seems a little bit rude in public, but also this particular trail I'm kind of responsible for maintaining, so that's a bit of a bummer. If I tore it up, I'd have to fix it myself, and I'm probably going to have to go back and rake gravel in the holes that I just created. If you were in a vehicle with a locker in the back, and especially a locker in the front, it would not feel like that. Now, on the other hand, you'd have to engage them, you'd have to disengage them, you'd have to worry about binding and system damage if you're driving it in an area where you suddenly have traction again. And in a quad motor setup, you don't have to worry about any of that. Quad motors have a lot of promise because you can send power around wherever it's needed. You have a very solid and stable feel out on the loose surfaces right here. The leaves are still wet from this morning where it was raining. There's definitely a lot of leaf cover, sticks, twigs, loose gravel, etc. But on the other hand, it's going to feel a little bit different than a vehicle with a true locker in the back. You're not going to get that binding feel. You're not going to get possible system damage because you suddenly find traction and all of a sudden the wheels need to spin at different rates and you're forcing them to spin at the same rate. But at the same time, it's not going to feel quite the same. I'm really intrigued to see what other SUV manufacturers like Jeep and Land Rover do over time, because they are coming out with supposedly very capable off-road vehicles themselves that are going to be fully electric. I'm really curious to see what Jeep and Land Rover give us when we get a full electric off-road vehicle from those brands. In the Hummer truck and the Hummer SUV, we do have a locker available up front, but the tri-motor setup has basically the same sort of thing going on in the back with the same sort of feel that we find here. I would be really intrigued, honestly, to see a single motor EV with a more traditional four-wheel drive setup. I know it's going to be a lot less efficient than something like this, but I really would be intrigued to see what that would be like out on the trail. If you're looking to get your hands on the R1S, be prepared to shell out and be prepared to wait, because you can currently place an order for a 2024 Rivian R1S. It's going to start at $78,000 for the base dual motor setup and the smallest battery pack, but it is going to be a little bit of a wait until you can actually get your hands on one. Although Rivian has been really improving their delivery numbers lately, and they're really starting to build the R1T and R1S in solid volume. So the wait should be a lot shorter in 2023, late 2023 and 2024 than it was last year. But $78,000 is a reasonably high starting price. Of course, the starting price on some of the competition is even higher, so it depends on exactly how you look at it. A Volvo EX90, for instance, is going to start right around this same window, about $80,000. We don't know whether the Volvo will get the tax credit or not. If it's under $80,000, it should get at least part of one, since it will be built in South Carolina. This will qualify for half the tax credit, depending on the versions you get, of course, because if it's over the price cap, it's not going to get any at all. If you get a Mercedes-Benz EQS SUV, it has an optional third row, but it's going to be more than $20,000 more than this. It starts at $104,400, and the third row is optional. The third row is also optional in the Tesla Model X, which starts at $79,990, which is pretty close to this, but it's an extra $3,500 for that third row. The Model X third row is smaller than this. The second row is not as comfortable as this, but it will get you further on a charge. All Model X's have smaller batteries than we find in this model, and they will still get you about as far or a little bit further depending on the version you get. And that's all down to the aerodynamic efficiency of the Model X. That egg shape definitely gives it an advantage. Being lower to the ground gives it an advantage, but there are trade-offs. Less room on the inside, and of course, not the same sort of thing as the Rivian R1S. If you want to off-road it, it's just going to be this one. Kind of a weird side competitor, I guess you could say, would be the EV9. It's going to be less expensive, probably start around $60,000 or so. It might have similar room to this. It's hard to tell exactly how the numbers line up. The third row is very generous in that EV9, but the range is not going to be its forte because the EV9 is going to have a much smaller battery pack. The Hummer, it's a two-row vehicle. It's a very different kind of vehicle as well, but it's in the same price range, about $79,995. Be sure and let me know what you think about the Rivian R1S and what are you interested in cross-shopping if you're interested in this vehicle. I really am intrigued by it because this is the blend of towing functionality, interior functionality, and roominess that I think would be an absolutely great fit for me. Charging infrastructure, I hate to say it, I'm normally not one to talk about this, but charging infrastructure for me is what's holding the R1S back, and its DC fast charge times. If this had a sustained higher charge rate and it could charge 10% to 80% in, say, about 25 minutes or so, and there were lots of pull-through DC fast charge stations so I could carry my excavator wherever it needs to go, then it would be a great fit, because this is the combination I end up towing quite a lot with. Three-row SUV, about that kind of curb weight on the back, occasionally a bit more, which is why we ended up with the SRT Durango, because its tow capacity is over 8,000 pounds. Charging is really just the issue, because this would certainly be my preference. I would love it if I didn't have to visit the gas station as often, if I could just plug it in and have the convenience of that. And the price tag, it's not far off where you find other big SUVs that can tow that much. If you want to tow this much in an SUV with a gasoline engine on board, you're talking about very rarefied air. The last few Durangos being sold, a few luxury vehicles, some full-size SUVs, etc. That's really the interesting thing about the Rivian R1S and, of course, its companion, the R1T. Be sure and sound off down there. Let me know, are you interested in one? Are you buying one? Have you bought one, etc.? And, of course, if you want to lend us your R1S or R1T because you might have a dual motor model, then reach out to us at hey@autobuyersguide.com. We are really interested in that one. Rivian did not have a dual motor for us to borrow, but I'm really curious about that model's efficiency. I'll see all of you later.